Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy to have my next guest on. He is the founder of the Tea Party movement, the founder of the Citizens for Self-Government, and for the subject of the podcast today, the co-founder of the Convention of States movement. Mark Meckler, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
It's a privilege. Good to be with you.
Yes, so one thing I've noticed is that you've started at least two movements that I'm aware of around some of my two top issues, that being national debt and spending and restoring kind of the American Constitution. You have this ability to kind of sense what's naturally occurring in the country and to kind of help organize that energy, which is, a skill that I don't think you can be taught. How do you do what you do?
Well, I'll tell you, Steve, that's very flattering and actually the highest compliment you could pay me, because that's all I really try to do. You said something about founding the Tea Party movement. Mm-hmm. And so there's a correction I want to give to that. And you already sort of gave it, which is I didn't really found the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement existed in the hearts and minds of the American people. This idea that we were fiscally out of control, that we had drifted away from our constitutional moorings, that the free market was under attack. That sentiment existed in the American population. It came to a boiling point at the end of the Bush administration, specifically when Bush said that he was abandoning the free market free market principles to save the free market. Mm-hmm. It reached a new crescendo in the Obama administration with the advent of Obamacare. That sentiment was out there, and I'm just a regular guy. And I think one of the things that allows me to work with and speak for the grassroots is I am one of them. So I'm not some guy in an ivory tower in a think tank somewhere. I'm not going to work for some big organization with a fancy office in Washington, D.C. I'm just a regular person out on the ground. And so I tend to have an ability to reflect what's out there on the ground. And it's something that I think is just God-given, but it's also something that I work on all the time to not be disconnected from that.
Yeah, do you have offices in DC? Because I was going to say, you don't. If you do, you're doing a great job of staying kind of grounded.
No, I don't like DC. I mean, I love DC for its history, but I don't like DC as a working city. It is like Las Vegas. It's got all the bad stuff about Las Vegas, but it doesn't admit that it's Sin City. It's a terrible place. I mean, there is money and sex and drugs and alcohol and ego, and all the bad things are there in completely overwhelming amounts, and I just don't like it. And so, no, my office is actually in my house just outside of Austin, Texas. About a year and a half ago, I moved from Northern California to Austin. My house in California had a barn, and the barn was where my office is. Now I'm in a library in my house, and that's it. We don't believe that we need to spend a bunch of money on overhead for a fancy office somewhere. All of our employees for the Convention of States Project, they all work from home. They're all over the country. We're just not into fancy offices.
Wow, that is just so awesome to hear all that. All right, so let's kind of get into the subject here. I think let's start, if I can, give a kind of a brief history of the Convention of States movement. And correct me if I'm wrong in anything. I believe it starts in about 2013. You have syndicated national radio host Mark Levin. He comes out with a book, The Liberty Amendments, Restoring the American Republic, in which he gives us 11 amendments, and shortly after, your organization started organizing and working with like-minded people and politicians and representatives. And since then, you guys have, I just checked the website today, 15 states fully passed it, 8 states have passed in one chamber, 17 have active legislation in their chambers, and 10 haven't gotten involved yet. Is that all mostly correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things I would add. Mm-hmm. One is that the legislation, the resolution itself has been introduced in 49 states now. Oh. It's pretty extraordinary. And here's the thing about the Mark Levin story. Mm-hmm. I always have to correct this. It's just a strange thing, and some people might call it serendipity. I'm a person of faith, so I would call it providence. Mm-hmm. When the Convention of States Project was brought to me by Mike Ferris, he's my co-founder for this project. It took him a little bit to explain it to me so that I understood it. We agreed as an organization to finance it. Mike and I ran it together. So we were getting this thing going, and we actually opened a very small office in Purcellville, Virginia. Mike was the chancellor of Patrick Henry College in Purcellville, Virginia. And we were getting the thing rolling, and I wanted Mark Levin's endorsement for what we were doing. One, I just thought that would be very useful. Two, Mark and I have been friends for a while. And so I reached out to Mark, and the way I reached out to Mark, though, was kind of unorthodox, which is I was speaking at a constitutional event in Tucson, Arizona, hosted by Hugh Hewitt. Mark had Skyped into the event as a guest. I was a panelist at this event, and as a panelist, I was able to ask Mark a question. And I did what all good heads of organizations do, is I asked a very self-serving question, which was, hey, Mark, what do you think about the idea of a convention of states? I feel like we've lost our country, that it doesn't really matter who we vote for because what ends up happening is they just do whatever they want in Washington, D.C., and that we really need to restructure the country and take the power away from D.C. and give it back to the American people. And Mark's response to me, this was live on Skype in front of a live audience. Mark's response to me, I'll never forget, because he is such an eloquent spokesperson, and he has so much to say about everything. And Mark's response went something like this. Well, I'm writing a book, and I can't really talk about it, but I agree with you. It's literally his entire response, and I thought, that is the weirdest Mark Levin response in the history of the world.
Yeah, wow.
You know, it's just so not Mark Levin, right? And so I was very confused by that. There were three of us on the dais on this panel, and it went on to the next person who got to ask Mark a question. We could see Mark up on the big screen because he was Skyped in. And, you know, you can picture Mark, he's scruffy beard, he's got his ratty kind of old baseball cap on. And as the next person is asking the question, he's looking down. And my phone is sitting on the dais in front of me, of course, set to vibrate so it won't go off. And it vibrates, and it's Levin. He's texting me, actually, while the next person is asking him the question. And he says, we need to talk. And I think, fantastic, I got him. This is so cool. He's really interested. And so after the event is over, I step out to the lobby, and I call Mark because I'm so excited about this. And Mark starts yelling at me, literally, you know, like a picture of the classic Mark Levin tirade, only it's at you directly in your ear. And he's furious, and he's saying things like, how dare you, and you had no right to do that, and nobody knows what my book is about. Well, I had no idea what Mark was talking about. I didn't know what his book was about. And I had just helped found this project with Mike Ferris, and I wanted him to like it, and so I brought it up. So eventually I was able to, you know, Mark stopped to take a breath, which is rare, and I jumped in and just said, hey, Mark, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he said, my book, my new book, the Liberty Amendments. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, it's about Article 5. I think it's the only way to save the country. If you didn't know about it, why did you ask me? And I explained to him that it was just self-serving. You know, I just wanted his input, and I hoped he would like our idea. And he was so stunned by this turn of events, as was I, that he said something I'll never forget. He said, you know, that's not coincidence, that's providence. And so literally what happened is the project itself and the book launched the same week in August of 2013, not because we planned it that way, but because, in my opinion, God intervened. The country needed this project. It needed somebody like Mark to elevate it. It needed somebody like myself and Mike Ferris to organize it, and that's how the pieces came together.
Wow, that is an incredible story. And, you know, I can just see now, like, that stumped Mark Levin, yeah, because he's, you know, his book is probably pretty secret when it's in development, and then he probably
it's actually legally embargoed, so he could get in big trouble for telling anybody what it was about, and that's why he was so upset with me. And he just figured maybe he told me at some point, or maybe somebody else told me, but you know, I didn't know, and he didn't know.
Wow, that is such an incredible story. Thank you so much for sharing that. But what I want to talk with you about in particular, about this movement, is after kind of talking to some of your representatives about kind of where you guys are at, I understand you guys are really focused on just trying to get to the convention. So kind of just working with people to pass the resolutions. And believe me, I can imagine trying to organize 50 different legislatures is probably like trying to herd cats who are chasing mice while being chased by dogs at the same time. I'm sure it's super...
That's a good description, yeah.
I'm sure it's super difficult. But at the same time, you know, I think we will see it in my lifetime, I'm pretty sure. I'm 31 now, and I'm sure that, you know, in the last 7 years, you guys have gotten, you know, almost halfway there, essentially, just to calling it. But I think it's as hard as this is to just get it started. I don't want to waste that opportunity because trying to organize something like this again seems to be, another just monumental task.
Yes.
And so I think it's kind of important to kind of start talking about like amendment ideas or at least like concepts of the amendments. Part of, I guess like when I'm thinking about amendments in particular, because that's kind of what I've been focusing on the last few years, is just kind of going, combing through the book, looking at and reading the amendments, and like just kind of asking like, how does this play out after you pass the amendments? So you have like, like let's even take Levin's example of his prohibition on tax or federal taxation, where they can't confiscate more than 15% of your annual income. So let's say we do all this work, we get it into law, and then, they just pass a law anyway. Say, oh, we're going to make it 20%. Or more likely what would happen, and we've seen this happen, they pass something else. Oh, maybe it's a penalty. Maybe it's some kind of insurance program or some kind of other big government program that requires more money. So instead of calling it a tax on income, they call it something else and they get the money anyway. It goes to a court, and the court say, "Oh yeah, no, this is no problem." I mean, we see this all the time.
Right.
So, the problem that I have with a lot of his amendments are that they're too weak in the sense where they only say things like Congress shall not do this. And I'm thinking to myself, we have a whole Constitution that already says Congress shall not do this, and then they do it anyway. And then, people will say that, well, the recourse is in the election process. And I just say, well, look at how's that doing for us? I mean,
not well.
Exactly. I mean, it's and even the framers. I just was reading Federalist 39 yesterday, and they really put a lot of emphasis in this idea of elections being this great check on politicians. And I just don't see that happening. I don't see anything changing. What I see is people like John McCain, for example, the late John McCain. When he would go to Congress, when he was in Congress, he was more I want to say he was more center left than he was right. But anytime he was campaigning back in his home state, he was very conservative. So you kind of had this disconnect where you campaign how you need to get elected, but then once you're there, you can do whatever you want, and there's nothing that you could vote for the opposite stuff you ran on, and there's absolutely no recourse. And so I think when we're talking about amendments, we need to have that in mind. We need to give, essentially, we need massive transfers of real power in the form of like a physical form of recourse. We need to give that back to the people instead of just saying, Congress, you won't do this. The president, you won't do this. Because I don't think those kinds of amendments are effective. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Look, I agree with you generally. And one of the things, and you said this in the opening of this portion, which is, I don't think that much about that. And we don't as an organization. Mm-hmm. And there are some very specific reasons for that. I want you to understand that first, mm-hmm. which is that the first reason is that as an organization, we looked at the history of Article 5, and why haven't we had an Article 5 convention called by the states in 243, almost 44 years now? And the biggest reason is because it's hard to get enough momentum, enough inertia towards this. It takes millions and millions, I think 30 million people in support until we get this. Mm-hmm. In order to do that, you have to have some really big ideas. And we do, I think. The idea of fiscal restraints on the federal government, very popular. Balanced budget, very popular. The idea of term limits, very popular. Mm-hmm. The idea of just limiting the scope and power of the jurisdiction of the federal government, very popular. All of those, by the way, the first two over 80% in polling for 30 years. The second one about 72%. So these are very popular, broad ideas. Mm-hmm. The second that I say, well, here is the specific amendment, then I will narrow support for the idea. In other words, if I were to say, this is the balanced budget amendment we propose, mm-hmm. there will be plenty of people who love balanced budget amendments that will say, yeah, but that one is dumb. We don't like that one. Mm-hmm. There are better ways to do this. And so that's the reason as an organization that we've never proposed and probably will never propose a specific amendment. That being said, I think what you're talking about and what you're doing is incredibly important. People need to do this. Mm-hmm. State legislators are starting to do it around the country, especially in the states where they've already passed the Convention of States resolution. And citizens like yourself, public figures, podcasters, radio personalities are starting to dig in and propose amendments. So I think we do have to start to get specific. Every state is going to bring, in my opinion, a slate of amendments with them. If we think about the Constitution as it was actually drafted, it's largely based on the Virginia plan. So a plan put together by Virginians, brought to the convention by Virginians. We're going to see a lot of that. Texas's Governor Abbott created the Texas plan for the amendments that he'd like to see Texas bring to the convention. So I think we're going to see that. It's going to take people like you getting very specific. As we get specific, I think one of the things is we're going to have to be very careful and do exactly what you said, which is it's not enough to say Congress shall not. The shall not, what we're saying shall not, has to be specific and yet broad. In other words, you talked about the difference between taxes and fees, and we know what the government's done with that. A fee is a tax. Somehow they say it's something different. So if we say shall not tax, they'll just say, okay, well, we'll impose a penalty or a fee. And so in whatever amendment we had to do around taxes, it would have to say no taxes, fees, or anything else called by the same name that has the effect of having funds flow from a private taxpayer to the federal government or something like that. Right. And so I don't think that, to be frank, I don't think that I'm expert enough to draft that language well. But there are people like you that are paying attention and doing the research and looking at the history. We'll need to look at court cases and the way the Supreme Court has interpreted language and do everything we can to lock down around that. I think that's critically important that work is being done now. And one last thing I would want to add, which is we do worry about whether the federal government will follow these, right? That's something people talk about at all. In fact, my number one question when Mike Ferris brought this project to me was, why would they follow these at all? I mean, they don't follow the Constitution right now. And he corrected me on that. And I think his correction is very true and very important, which is actually the federal government by and large does follow the Constitution. There are exceptions, but by and large they do. The problem is that today in America we have two constitutions, and most Americans don't realize this. We have the one that you've been studying, that you're reading the Federalist Papers and studying that are about that Constitution. You can carry that one around in your pocket, and a lot of people do, in a pocket Constitution. But the actual Constitution we live under, you can order from the Federal Government Printing Office, the GPO, and it is, right now, with all the supplements, over 3,000 pages long. It is every case ever issued by the United States Supreme Court interpreting the U.S. Constitution. And so the problem is that what have the courts done with the Constitution over decades and frankly, at this point, over centuries, right? And the answer is they've completely bastardized the thing. They turned it into this behemoth that nobody can understand. We all can understand it. Read the Federalist Papers, read the Constitution, you can understand it. But if you look at that big book, nobody's ever read it, nobody understands it. Here's a huge caveat to that. So they follow that one. The big caveat is when we've passed amendments in the United States of America, and we've passed 27 of them, by and large, they are followed pretty much to the letter and the intent for at least 100 years. And the reason for that is not magic. It's not pixie dust. It's because of the amount of political muscle that it takes to ratify an amendment. It takes 3/4 of the states in the nation, essentially representing roughly 3/4 of the population, to enthusiastically say yes to something before it becomes part of the Constitution. And both politicians and the courts are loath to stand against that measure of public opinion for a time period. Now, after 100 years, the people who passed that thing aren't even alive anymore. That public opinion doesn't necessarily exist. And I think that the courts and the politicians tend to stray. And so I do think it's important we craft them correctly and as tightly as humanly possible. But I think even if we do that over 100 years, we're going to see them chip away at it.
You know, so many great points to talk about there. You know, you talk about how there really is two different constitutions. There's the original Constitution that like you said, that we study in the Federalist Papers and in the original source material and the historical record. And then there's this one that you're taught in law school, which is completely grounded in judicial activism, and which, I mean, largely just amounts to anti-constitutionalism, whereby judges just change the meaning of words to fit whatever policy preference that they want. And they use fancy language. I think probably the most famous one is the emanations and penumbras. And yeah, so we are dealing with that kind of battle. I can tell you, I have a book called the Heritage Guide to the Constitution, where they kind of...
I've got it on my shelf right behind me. Know it well.
Yeah, and exactly. It's like, and it's so funny because like every clause that they talk about is broken down into like, here's what it meant, and then here's how it is kind of like today. Here's what the court said about this, and the court said about that, and it's like you can't get away from the court's role in the Constitution, which, I mean, by any measure, if you just read the original Constitution, they have no power to do any of that. And it's just mind-boggling how, you have the weakest branch of government grant itself a new power to become a branch of oligarchy for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, they really are now the supreme branch of government.
Exactly.
Interestingly, you mentioned law school. When I went to law school way back when, and this goes back a long ways. By the way, Justice Kennedy was a constitutional teacher at our law school.
Mm-hmm.
And I had somebody ask me, this goes back probably, 6 years ago, something like that, 7 years ago. Somebody asked me at a public event, did you read the Constitution in law school? And I was offended, honestly, because every first-year law student takes con law. And so, of course, we read the Constitution, except for we don't. I started to think about it, and I thought, wait, no, we never read the Constitution. Like you said, what we read is what jurists, mostly for the last 100 years, primarily 115 years, had told us about their view of what the Constitution meant, stuff that was mostly post-Marbury versus Madison, so means the Supreme Court had the ultimate power to tell us what that meant, and that's all I ever learned. And so ever since then, I went around and I asked all the lawyers I know, every time I talk to a lawyer, I ask them, did you actually read the Constitution in law school? They all have the same response as me. If they haven't thought about it, they all say, yeah, well, of course we, and then I'm like, really? No? And none of them did. And they just don't read the Constitution in law school. It's just infuriating in hindsight.
Yeah, but at the same time, you can't really blame them because it's not even applicable anymore in the courtrooms. If they start going in there and citing James Madison, judges are going to look at them and go, what are you talking about? No, you have to ground it in this precedent and this precedent. So, I mean, I understand it, but it is just truly a tragedy. Also, you had mentioned, this idea that like they are following the Constitution and everything. And I'd want to point out what's interesting about the idea. Well, really, actually, let me back up a little more. The idea that the current Constitution is kind of it is structured in this way that's like Congress shall not do this, Congress shall not do that, and as I think we agree, they violate that all the time with certain respects. But what's interesting to note is sometimes it is followed, and one of the greatest examples of this are in the presidential term limits. And where you see, you could ask, why would someone like Barack Obama even bother? Why not just run for a third term? Like, why not? We can ignore all the other rules. We can ignore separations of power. We can grant ourselves new powers if we're the courts. I mean, why not just run for a third term? And the reason that he can't, and the reason that no one can, is because someone else has claimed that. And so, the Constitution actually gives that other person power to say, listen, no, I have the power now. You're out of here. And, that kind of, when I'm looking at that kind of gave me the framework of if we were going to draft amendments, we can't just have Congress shall not do this or do that. You need to actually give someone else the ability to step in and say, hey, listen, you just did this. No, you're not doing this anymore because I have the power. And
yeah, and I love that idea, by the way. So you're talking about the idea of balancing power.
Yes.
And fundamentally, this was something that the founders believed in. I think sometimes when we look back at the founding era, we have a misimpression. And in the last 10 years, I've read an immense amount about the founding era. My office is in a library. I've got hundreds of books, a good chunk of them about the founding era. And I love to read, you mentioned early on, the original source materials. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the founders really believed is that we're not all that great. We're just fallen people, right? And they got that. And I think we idolize them in a way that they would find very uncomfortable because they knew that they were fallen. They were men and women just like us with the same flaws and going through the same problems and the same foibles. So they designed a system of, we've heard this over and over, the word is checks and balances. And we know about, or we think about the checks and balances in the sense of government structure, but it was also intended, and this phrase is from the founding era, to balance avarice against avarice and greed against greed, right? In other words, people are going to be greedy. People are going to desire power. People are going to have egos. So you set up a system where those things have to compete with each other. There always has to be a balance of power to prevent one branch or another, one person or another from becoming too powerful. So when you're talking about having this sort of counterbalancing power on any given item to make sure that it's enforced, I love that idea, and I think the founders would too.
Yeah, I think what I've tried to do is, I think uh, those of us who have tried to like draft our own amendments, at least one exercise I do, I'll write something out, and this is what I was doing kind of in the beginning, is I would write an amendment out, and I would go, how would I get around that? And it was, I mean, so evidently clear to me that it's easy. You just don't do it, or you can call it something else, or this and that, and it just, listening to you there, it just reminds me going back to the founding, and you think about what the work that these men did, where they literally at one point we had no society that was grounded in liberty whatsoever. You had other societies that had trace hints here and there. We were kind of moving in sort of the right direction with Rome and Greece and England and these places. And in their lifetime, they went from having nothing to the American Republic, all within, a very short amount of time. And they did the best they could with the time that they were given. And that's why I had nothing but admiration for the work that they did. But I often wonder, like, what if they were given like an extra lifetime to live and observe and to think and to ponder things? And like, how would those ideas have grown and expanded? Because the idea that it stops there, that there's no other kind of forms of liberty or kind of ways to make it better or improve upon it, that I don't agree with at all. And so, like yourself, I've kind of been diving into the Federalist Papers, diving into the research, the Anti-Federalist Papers, as much original source material as I can. And that's why I kind of have come up with this idea of like, instead of saying shall not, let's give actual powers to people. Like, we grant powers to government. Like, we should grant powers to people to repeal government and to hold government back. Because the system the founders created, and I don't think that they really thought about it because they were trying to create a government, especially the Federalists were at this point in time, that government can only grow in one direction. I mean, there's no system in place that incentivizes Congress to repeal laws or to otherwise kind of look at things, and think, well, maybe we don't need this anymore, or maybe this doesn't apply. When you look at the Federal Register, I think it's evident that, government only grows in one direction. We're drowned in so many laws, millions of laws at this point, millions of pages. And I think that leads to, it's so easy to lead to corruption, because now with so many laws, you can almost find any reason to force an interaction with the citizens against their will, and to, either fine them, put them in prison, and there's no recourse beyond that. There's no recourse for anything the court does. Besides elections, there's no recourse you can do to anyone just currently sitting in Congress. And the power balance is so unbalanced when I look at it through that prism.
Yeah, look, and the founders were really clear that the Constitution wasn't perfect. This is another thing. I fear that we treat the Constitution like Scripture. Mm-hmm. And I want to be really clear. I have a deep reverence for the Constitution. It is unequivocally, and I would say factually, not just by my opinion, but by its performance, the greatest government document ever created in the history of man. And, clearly man-made. Some would say God-inspired, but the greatest governing document ever created, but it was not perfect. Mm-hmm. And the founders said that they did the best that they could with what they knew at the time. They had a deep understanding of history. They had a deep understanding of human nature, and they included those two things, those two perspectives, in order to come up with the best system that they possibly could. Mm-hmm. But they also knew and said that over time, they hope that others will come and who will do better from the wisdom of experience. And this is the reason that they gave us the mechanisms for changing the Constitution. If they thought it was perfect, well, no mechanisms for changing it would be necessary. Mm-hmm. But they understood, and in Article 5, they gave Congress the power to propose amendments. They gave the states, the people acting through the states, the power to call a convention and propose amendments, because they did expect that you and I would hopefully garner wisdom over a couple hundred years and do something better.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and kind of discuss some of the more common, more difficult opposition arguments that you've run into.
Sure.
I find the one that is probably the most, appealing, maybe most common, is the difference between nullification the difference between Article 5 and nullification. For those that aren't aware, nullification is the idea that through the Ninth and Tenth Amendment, that a state government can effectively nullify a law that it thinks is unconstitutional. Tom Woods has a pretty good book on this, actually, and he goes over the history, with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which is interesting because it's interesting because we're talking about the same guys. We're talking about Thomas Jefferson. We're talking about James Madison. And it's funny because at one point in their lives, these guys are kind of the Federalists that are giving us this Constitution that they believe in. They become these guys who other people ground their ideas in nullification in. And then I think later on in Madison's life, he writes a letter to, I think, William Everett, I think his name was. And he kind of talks about this idea of nullification versus Article 5. And he says that ultimately, Article 5 is the better process because it's the legal process found it. And I think it's obvious that if you're going to use nullification, then who gets to define what's constitutional? I mean, if it's left up to the states, there's a good chance that they might violate things that are actually constitutional. And there's no way to check or balance that, really. So your thoughts?
Well, look, there's a couple of reasons that I would say that I am sort of anti-nullification. Mm-hmm. One is, and this is actually the most important one to me, is about narrative. And so in any political battle, who's right and who's wrong matters, but what matters even more is how you talk about it. Mm-hmm. And the narration, the narrative, the story matter, especially in our modern media era. This has always been true, but it's even more so with the instant spread of communication today. The word nullification itself is tied inextricably to the Civil War. And it is tied inextricably to the idea of people wishing to protect the institution of slavery by nullifying anything that the federal government would do to do away with the institution of slavery. We can argue about whether those things are correct or incorrect, but that is just historical fact that these are the perceptions that are out there in the American public. The second that you start talking about nullification, you will absolutely be accused of being part of the new Confederacy, white supremacists. Now you get accused of that for anything. Yeah. But that language is indeed tied to the pro-slavery side of the Civil War. And so that's just not a fight that's worth having. I never want to start any particular political fight on my heels. I always want to start leaning into the fight. And that's a fight you're going to start leaning on your heels, and you're going to lose that fight. And I've watched this happen over and over in state legislatures around the country. People bring up nullification. They say what we're trying to do is some form of nullification. I stand against nullification. I also think that the Supreme Court, whether we like it or not, I think it's correct or not, has come out firmly against nullification and said nullification is unconstitutional. And so it's just not practical from either a legal or a narrative perspective. And I think it is inherently destabilizing. I think a form of nullification that would be appropriate, it's in Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, is pick your number with 3/4, 3/5, 2/3 of states stand against a law promulgated by the federal government within a certain time period. That law may be abrogated. I think that's a good form of nullification.
But even that, I would suggest, really isn't even nullification because it's a legal process. It'd be, if we went through the convention and got that amendment passed, that'd be a part of the system. It'd be a part of the process. It would be completely legitimate. Whereas kind of nullification is really arbitrary, and it's really kind of grounded in whatever the person thinks is right or wrong. And it's like there's, and as we know, men are evil and ambitious and have, suffer from all these imperfections. And who's to say that maybe Texas might take nullification and use it properly, but maybe New York might say, you know what, we're nullifying the Second Amendment because we just because we can. So it's like a double-edged sword, and I think
I agree with that, and I think it's so again now you're getting into the sort of the practical aspects of it, and also one of the things that I say because I'll get people who tell me, well, I think we should use nullification instead of Article 5. And my answer is, so how's that going for you? Do you have millions of people engaged in a movement? Do you have a bunch of states that have signed on in support of this? And of course they don't. And their response to me often, Steve, is, well, if you would just promote this, it's not that simple. You have to have an idea that people want, or promoting it doesn't work. And so the bottom line is, like, nullification as an idea has been around for, obviously, since the beginning of the country, basically. And it's not a successful idea. It hasn't worked, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, and what's funny is I think at least I remember there being something called the 10th Amendment Center, which I think was the organization dedicated to nullification. I'm not sure
Yes.
where they are or how they're doing, but at the same time, I sympathize with these guys. I think that they are
Yes.
kind of fellow liberty lovers like myself. Um, but at the same time, and it's so, I'm just thinking about your comparison to the Civil War, and I'm just thinking to myself, even if we did, let's say we join them in that movement of nullification, I mean, the federal government would look at that and they could easily say that's another insurrection. That's another, I mean, they could treat it just like, as you describe in they could just say it's another civil war. Like you're illegitimately trying to seize power from us.
Agreed. I completely agree with you. And so, again, it becomes a practical matter. And from a practical political perspective, is this something that actually works? And in regard to nullification, the answer is unequivocally no.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other more common arguments you get? I think there's nullification. There's the idea of the runaway convention, which I think is probably the most popular one.
Yes, that is.
It's probably, and I mean, I guess I have concerns about it a little bit, but at the same time, I feel like the people involved in this movement, most of them I'd have to say are conservatives. I don't think a lot of the more radical left are going to be wanting to get involved with that, because the point of the convention, or the point of this whole process, is to like kind of limit government and to kind of reduce it back to its constitutional constraints. So I don't think they'll have much of a say or much of an input in the actual convention itself. But give me your take on it.
Sure. Well, I'm going to start where you left off there, which is the radical left. And so one of the things, and this is one of the simpler arguments in my opinion, one of the things that you should look at, that anybody should look at, your listeners should pay attention to, when they're hearing about an idea, they may not be experts on it. We can't all be experts on everything, right? I mean, I know this subject really well because it's what I do, but lots of things I don't know about. And so if there's something I don't know about, I'm going to look to the experts who I trust and say, what do they think? And I'm also going to look to people that I don't like so much and see what they think about it. And so in this case, what you have is literally every single major conservative name in the United States of America that's weighed in on this. Anybody that your listeners would know because they're a national figure is in favor of this. Obviously, you've got Mark Levin, you've got Ben Shapiro, you've got Hannity, you've got Charlie Kirk, we've got Pete Hegseth from Fox and Friends, Chuck Cooper, who was the outside litigator for the NRA, protecting the Second Amendment for over 30 years. He was Reagan's personal constitutional attorney. Robbie George, who is, I would argue, the most prominent conservative legal professor in the United States of America. He's at Princeton. You've got Randy Barnett, the most prominent libertarian legal professor in the country. He runs the Georgetown Center for the Constitution, and many, many others, all in support of this, all say that it can't run away, all say that it's safe. You can look on our website at conventionofstates.com. They all signed something, drafted and signed something called the Jefferson Statement. The flip side of that is, so what's the left to think about this? I mean, if it could run away and they could do whatever they want, then obviously they would love this because they would like to destroy the Constitution, right? Mm-hmm. Instead, 3 years ago on Good Friday, every radical leftist organization in the United States of America, led by George Soros's Common Cause and Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, signed a press release saying that the use of Article 5 is the most dangerous thing happening in America today, and that they're all against it. I'm talking Planned Parenthood, La Raza, Socialist Party of America, Daily Cause, MoveOn.org. All of them signed onto a press release in their own words saying how horrible and dangerous the idea of a convention of states is. Now, I would say if I was a conservative looking at this and I saw all conservatives, or at least all nationally known conservatives, say yes, all radical leftist groups say no, it's pretty easy for me to decide which camp I'm in.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, I did not know about that coalition.
Yeah, and all that stuff, by the way, this is really important to me, too. I'm a source materials guy. I know you are as well. Mm-hmm. Everything I just told you is on our website. You can link to their press release. You can see who all of our endorsers are. And so nobody has to trust me on this. There's a second piece that I think is really important about this, and it's a question of where to get your information from. And so there is an idea about the runaway convention, and it's been spread through the American population, I think, a lot like a nasty virus, to make it topical for today. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea that there can be a runaway convention. So where'd that come from? Because I can tell you back, say, in the 1960s, early 1970s, you could search runaway convention if there were an internet back then, and you wouldn't find those words. Mm-hmm. They didn't exist. So where did it come from? Well, here's where it comes from. after 1973, you get Roe versus Wade. You talked about penumbras coming out of Roe versus Wade, emanations and penumbras.
Mm-hmm.
So we get Roe versus Wade, and states immediately start passing Article 5 applications to overturn Roe versus Wade, to make abortion illegal. And that's a movement that gets some pretty serious steam. Ultimately, 20 states sign on to that movement. And what happens is, at some point, and I can't explain to you why, and she's deceased now, so she can't explain to us,
Mm-hmm.
Phyllis Schlafly, who was the founder of an organization called Eagle Forum, a great conservative woman, by the way, conservative constitutional attorney, fighter for life. She ended up becoming friends with Chief Justice Warren Burger. Burger is the Chief Justice who gave us Roe versus Wade. He signed that opinion. He was the Chief Justice during the time of Roe versus Wade.
Mm-hmm.
She serves on the Bicentennial Committee for the Constitution with Burger. They become friends. And at some point, she writes him a letter and says, what do you think about this idea of an Article 5 convention? Well, what do you think he's going to say? I mean, at that point in history, he sees that there's a movement to overturn the seminal decision of his career, and he's worried about that. And so he says, this is crazy. We could lose our Constitution in a runaway convention. And then what happens is he gets help from Yale law professors and Harvard law professors to start writing articles about this idea of a runaway convention. Phyllis takes this and runs with it, spreads this idea around, and the rest is history. Bring it up to the current moment. Look, they still cite Burger today about this runaway convention thing, and other leftists who have said the same thing. Primarily today, still leftists arguing against it. Unfortunately, people on the right, some people have picked this up. The definitive article on this, so again, don't trust me, the definitive article on this written by David Horowitz, the greatest American scholar on the American left, and he said this is just a masterful piece of leftist propaganda that has turned people on the right against the one tool they can use constitutionally to fight back against the left. And you can find that on our website. You look up David Horowitz on our website,
Mm-hmm.
and you can find this article. He researched it. He wrote it. And so that's kind of the history argument about where does this runaway convention argument come from.
Wow, I actually didn't know that. I always thought that the idea of the runaway convention was actually grounded in the founding in the country. I mean, I've heard, and you probably have too, this argument that the Constitution itself was this, it was a rogue convention. They defied the orders that they were sent to modify just the Articles of Confederation. They went there, they came with a new plan. It was totally illegitimate, this and that. And I think Michael Ferris actually wrote a huge kind of a research paper on this issue, and it's on my to-do list to read, but I haven't gotten to it yet. But and also actually in the Federalist Papers, I'm just getting into that subject as well, where Madison is talking about in Federalist 39 the same subject, like who ratifies the Constitution, how is it legitimate. So I'm just on the cusp of reading into all that stuff. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the greatest historical slanders in world history. And it's really outrageous on its face if you think about it. So these are men that went to this convention that people like you and I hold in high reverence. And the thing that was most important to men of that era, and it's a little bit hard for us to understand how important today, was the idea of honor, of keeping your word, right? Honor was held in such high esteem, somebody being honorable and honest, it was held in such high esteem that you could actually kill another man for lying about you. And there's no consequence for that.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so we think of Burr and Hamilton, right?
Yep.
And so this is the setting, the stage for the convention. And so now what those who would say there's a runaway convention are saying, these men who we hold in such high esteem, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Madison, Adams, of course Jefferson was not present, but these men that we hold in such high esteem had instructions, and their instructions were just to amend the Articles of Confederation, but they just blew all that stuff off. It doesn't make any sense for the men of the times, and it's not factually correct either. And here's how we know this. First of all, let's step back one step before the convention of 1787. There's the Annapolis Convention, which some people would call the dry run or the practice convention. And 5 states sent delegates to the Annapolis Convention, and they were there to discuss commercial matters only, matters of trade. And they realized having only 5 states, 5 colonies, it just wasn't enough. It didn't work to have the 5 states. They needed more there. And they realized, they also wrote about this, we didn't have the proper authority. We had to deal with many more things other than trade. Okay, so these the same kind of guys, some of the same men were in Annapolis and said, yeah, we don't have the authority to do what we need to do, so let's go home and get the authority. And so they did. They went home and they got the authority. Virginia was the first state to issue the call for the convention. So this is something that had been lost to history, not Congress, by the way. Congress didn't call the convention. In fact, if you read the Articles of Confederation, Congress has no authority to call a convention. It's such a mechanism doesn't even exist in the Articles of Confederation. Congress has no authority to call for amendments. They have no authority in this regard at all. And so the idea that Congress called, it is a historical misrepresentation. Virginia called. By the time Congress even spoke on the subject, 7 states had called for convention and had actually commissioned their commissioners to that convention. And they had empowered the commissioners through something actually called a commission, a piece of paper that said what the authority was of the commissioner. Ultimately, all but 2 states have virtually the same language in them. And the language says, the commissioner has any and all authority necessary to render the federal constitution adequate for the exigencies of the Union. No limitation. It didn't say to amend the Articles of Confederation. So where do we get that? Well, after 7 states issue these commissions and call for the convention, Congress does then what they do today. Oh, my goodness, there's something going on. We better say something about this and participate in this. It's already happening. We're behind the curve. And they say, hey, we agree this ought to be done. And they use the language, amend the Articles of Confederation, but they have no authority. And even in their own document, they say, we recommend the states gather. In other words, no, we don't have any authority. It doesn't say we call a convention, because a call was something very specific. They do not call the convention because they understand they have no authority to call. So the delegates or the commissioners to the convention have full authority as granted by the states. I think it's Federalist 41. Madison actually says if you want to know what the authority of the commissioners was, look to the state. And we've now done that. You can actually go online. You can read the commissions of all the commissioners. I've done that. You can read Rob Nadelson's work. You can read Mike Ferris's work. The article you're talking about was in the Harvard Journal of Law and Business, 85 pages, including footnotes. Mm-hmm. It's definitive. There was no runaway convention. And Steve, I got to tell you, this is part of my life's work. My passion is to clear the name of the founders and the framers. These were great men who had very high standards of honor, and they would not do what they have been widely accused of doing.
Wow, that is just a fantastic piece of lost history. And I assumed it was something like that. Like I said, I didn't get a chance to read his work yet, but the idea, like you said, reputation was so important to them. And it's like, that's why, like, even with things like free speech and everything, you weren't allowed to lie about someone. You weren't allowed to lie about people's people's reputations. You weren't allowed to, even in the press, you weren't allowed to just lie about people, because that you could be held seriously liable for that. So it's just, wow, great stuff here. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit into kind of like specific amendments. We've kind of talked about certain principles of amendments, but when we kind of like go to write something down, the one thing that I've been working on is what I call like the citizen override, which essentially, to make a long story short, it grants citizens, both at the local, state, and federal level, to effectively make, or either to remove laws, remove an official, remove a government employee who may be negligent. And it's just, you take some kind of vote, and I'm still working out the numbers and everything, whether it's a percentage of the population or, percentage of counties in a state at the state level. So the numbers are, we can argue back and forth on. But the idea is to give like people at the grassroots level a way to effectuate and remove things that are just burdens to their life, or things that are, whether it be it's something as simple as like an abusive cop, an abusive DMV employee, or as high as a senator. Maybe the senator is not doing what he said he was going to do during his campaign, and he's now signing on to a bill that he said he wasn't going to do. Oh no, we can recall him, we can remove him from office. And then obviously there's some other details in there that we can go over. But kind of what's your first initial reaction to that?
Look, I'm an advocate for the grassroots, so generically I love it. And one of the things that frustrates me is in most states we do have the right of recall. But we don't have that at the federal level, and I think that is a terrible injustice. I think we saw a place where this would be, speaking at the federal level, super important. During the fight over Obamacare, there were people who voted in a way that would have absolutely caused them to be immediately recalled. And there was no mechanism for doing this. And this is a really difficult thing because, as a matter of course, the public has a short memory. That's not a slam on the public. Life moves on. And so if you get a senator and they've been in office for a year and they do something just outrageous, the population's completely outraged. There's no removing them, and it's another 5 years until you get to vote on them.
Yes, you're so
right. And I think so I think that's just a terrible, terrible problem. I don't have a problem with the length of their terms, but there should be a removal mechanism for egregious behavior that flies against the opinion of the people that they represent. At the local and state level, a lot of state electeds, there is a right of recall, so I like that. You're delving into, when you say a DMV employee or things like that, another area that is really sort of home base for me, which is the abuse of the administrative state.
Yes.
And I think we have a fundamental problem in America to do with the very existence of the administrative state and the way it operates, both structurally and legally. And that is that, first of all, I think in large measure at the federal level, the administrative state is unconstitutional as currently constituted.
Mm-hmm.
To simplify that, what I mean by that is Congress is supposed to make all the laws. And for those who don't know this, most of what Congress does nowadays is what is called enabling legislation. In other words, they say, we want the air to be clean, and we give authority to the Secretary of Energy to promulgate such regulations as are necessary to ensure clean air. Okay, what that means is nothing. It means literally nothing. Yes. It just means we give that authority to somebody else. Well, no, wait, hold on a second. Congress passes the laws. Well, so now they say, you talked about this language abuse, right? So, well, they're not laws, they're regulations. Well, wait a minute. If you violate them, are there penalties? Yes. Who decides what the penalties are? Well, the administrative agency. Well, who will try you for the violation of those regulations? Well, the administrative agency. Who will punish you for the violation of those regulations? The administrative agency. So the agency has now violated all separation of powers. They have a power that's illegitimate in the first place, but now they are promulgating the laws. Though they call them regulations. They are prosecuting you for the violation of those things, and they are convicting you. They are lawmaker. They are judge. They are jury. I mean, it's just absolutely outrageous. And then what this does to the lawmakers, the actual lawmakers in Congress, is allows them to escape responsibility for these hideous systems they've created. And you hear them say things like, the EPA is just out of control. Well, wait, who gives the EPA its authority? You do. Right? We're going to get on top of that. And I think there is a business that Congress is in that drives me crazy, which is, I call it the keep the wolf from the door business. In other words, so they will help you. They constituent services. Call your congressman and let them know that you're being abused by the EPA, and they will try to help you. And often they will try to help you. But the EPA is out of control because Congress lets them be out of control. So anything that we could do, any idea you have about how to rein in the administrative agencies, how to rein in employees. Here's another one that I would add to this. I really think that we need to have a constitutional prohibition on public employee unions in the United States of America. I think they are incredibly harmful. A very staunch conservative by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, obviously I'm being tongue-in-cheek, said that that unions were fundamentally incompatible with public employment. They are just an invitation to corruption. They are corruption by their very nature. And this is one of the reasons you can't get rid of employees. They're bad employees, they're abusive employees, they're employees that are doing illegal things, and these unions have so much power, you can't remove these employees. So anything you could do to gut that power, I'm completely in favor of that.
Oh, that's awesome. And I mean, you bring up just the administrative state, the EPA, and these organizations that exercise all three powers of government. I mean, it's just a gross violation of separation of powers. It's just insane that it even exists in the first place. But let's not forget, I mean, in recent times, the FBI abuses with the Trump administration and this illegal spying scheme that's been going on. The IRS targeting the conservative 501c3 nonprofit organizations. what happened to these people? I mean, it took, President Trump himself was barely able to fire James Comey without having all this rainfall on him for doing so, even though he had complete authority to do it anyway. I think part of the citizen override is to actually make these people accountable too, is to say, listen, these people were involved in this scandal. Well, if Congress isn't going to remove them and the president isn't going to remove them, or whatever the process is, then the citizens should be able to say, no, this person abused their power. We don't want them there. Because at the end of the day, the fundamental premise of this is that everything about government is power that was given to them by the people on retainer almost. Like, it's not as if it's their power. They're temporary stewards. And I think somewhere along the line, government employees, government officials, elected officials, they forgot this basic principle that the power you have is because we gave it to you. And we've been nice enough, I guess, over the last couple hundred years to kind of let you do what you want with it. But I think that it's beyond even debate at this point that they're abusing that power. And so we rightfully should take it back, and take it back in a very strong, powerful, forceful way. And, we talk about just officials and maybe even some laws and stuff. I'd go even beyond that. I would go any regulations, any taxes, any fines, any penalties, any court orders, any executive orders, any court decisions that are just outrageous, any sentences that they might have made in the past that we think are illegitimate, all sorts of things. I mean, why limit it to just some aspects of the government? But do you think that's too far, or what's your initial reaction to that?
No, I don't think it's too far. I mean, could you cover all that in one amendment? I don't know. I would, I'd have to see that and think about that, but I don't think that's too far at all. I think you're addressing right now, in my opinion, the fundamental problem in our system of governance today. And some of this has been broken structurally. Some of it is now a cultural issue. Our government was founded on a unique premise, and you were just addressing it, which is it's founded on the idea of the consent of the governed. And by the way, this is a biblical principle. If you want to know where we get this, you go all the way back to the last time that there really was consent of the governed. You go to the Old Testament, to the period of the judges, and the Israelites had no rulers. There was no king. They only had judges to help them work out their disputes, and the judges were chosen by the people. They're really interesting from a scriptural perspective, a biblical perspective, because you could argue, well, God would know best who should be chosen, but the system was set up, and in my opinion, God set it up this way so that people had to consent to who was going to govern them, in this case, judge them. And so now we have a system based on literally this language, the consent of the governed. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that when you do the polling today, the majority of people today in the United States of America, I said majority, it's actually, I think, a plurality. I think 42% now say that the federal government no longer has the consent of the governed, no longer has our consent. This is a fundamental problem, and it is what I would call a pre-revolutionary attitude. This was the attitude of the founders prior to the American Revolution. It wasn't that they hated the system of governance. It's that the system of governance had become corrupt and had lost the consent of the governed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it kind of even points to a deeper principle, and that is that, I would suggest that the idea of freedom, as in the American sense, we would call it like American freedom or American liberty. It comes from the Bible itself. I mean, the whole point of life, I guess, from the biblical perspective, is that God wants a relationship with you, essentially. And he doesn't want you to come by force. I mean, God is completely anti-coercion. I mean, it makes no sense. It just wouldn't make any sense if we were able to take someone and say, hey, you're going to believe in God now. And they say, no, I don't believe in that. And then you force them and you bring that person to God and you say, hey, I got you a convert. What do we think Jesus would have done if Peter was bringing these, essentially slaves to him and saying, hey, this is your God now? I don't think he'd be really happy about it. Jesus, and it was after people's hearts and everything. But the only way that happens, the only way that relationship can actually happen, is if you are free to do it, free to choose that path. And I think we derive that source of freedom into the American system. And we go, well, people need to be free in order to do stuff, not just economic stuff and political stuff, and to kind of live their lives and pursuit of happiness, life and liberty. But it's also for that reason, at the end of the day, is are you going to choose God or not? And I think that's that underlying, probably the most fundamental principle that we can get to when we look at the Constitution and the Bible and where this concept of freedom comes from. I know it's kind of
so
deep,
what you're talking about the fundamental concept of free will, which is obviously biblical, right?
Yep.
And so we were given free will by our Creator, and this is the place on earth where we've now been given this place to exercise that free will to the largest extent possible. And the question is, for us today, what are we going to do with that? That's our responsibility, right? With great benefit, with this great gift we've been given, then it's our responsibility to do something with that. And the question for us today is, what will we do with that?
Absolutely. And, I think that's a perfect place to end at. Before I go, any final thoughts? How can people get involved with your project and with your organization? And what kind of work would they be looking at if they got involved?
Sure. So they can get involved by going to conventionofstates.com. Sign the petition. That'll go to your legislators and let them know you're in support. And then you can click the volunteer button. You can look at all the different positions. And the answer is pretty much anything you want. We have people that do nothing but make phone calls. They're not technologically savvy, and they like to just call and support. We have content writers. We have what we call social media warriors. They engage in social media tactics online all the time. We have people who are district captains in every state legislative district in the United States of America, and then on up through the organization to being a state leader, a state media liaison, a state legislative liaison, all these positions. But here's what I would say that's the most important thing, which is, what are you going to do? Not what are you going to think, not what are you going to talk about, not which TV host are you going to yell at or like the most. The question is, what are you going to do? I would argue that today, it's not rhetoric. Our country is more at stake than any time I've seen in my entire life. I'm 58 years old. I've seen some stuff, and it's been bad. It's never been this bad. Marxism is on the march. I would argue we're in the midst of a full-blown Marxist revolution in the United States of America. It's taking place now, including the early violence that we're seeing on the streets. Marxism is marching in America. And so the question is, what will you do? Will you listen to podcasts, which you should, and I'm glad you're listening to this one, or will you actually go beyond that and listen and then do something? And my response to you is, for God's sake, please do something, because otherwise we're going to lose the country. The country will remember us. History will remember us. This nation's been around a long time. They're going to remember our generation. There's a question they're going to ask is, were we the generation that let the flame of liberty be extinguished, or did we rise up and become the next greatest generation and do what it took to preserve liberty? And I will tell you, for me personally, at 58 years old, I'll do whatever it takes. I will fight. I will stand. I will not kneel. I will stand against injustice, including racial injustice, to be topical and current, but I will not kneel before any man, and certainly not for our flag, and certainly not for our national anthem. I will stand and defend our history, our culture, and this nation, and I hope that your listeners will do the same.
Beautifully said, Mark. Thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. For what it's worth, this podcast, myself personally, we totally endorse you guys. I'll do anything I can to promote you guys. And definitely let's hope that we can make some real changes and put us back on the proper path to liberty and pursuit of happiness.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for covering the subject matter. God bless you, and let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Definitely we'll have to do this again sometime. But until then, we'll talk to you later, Mark. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, till next time.